Joining me now is retired Army Officer General Sir Richard Shirreff, who formerly served as NATO's Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe. General, thank you very much for being with us. And I just want to pick up on what the US Defense Secretary said he wants to see, which is Russia weakened militarily so they can't do anything like this again. For that to happen, doesn't that require a more substantial NATO involvement in all this?
Well, good evening to you. And in essence, I think he's absolutely right. Lloyd Austin is absolutely right to say that he'd like to see a weakened Russia. I think we'd all like to see a weakened Russia, and a Russia that is not capable of inflicting the unspeakable things that it is doing on Ukraine. I guess the question is how you get there. And the first point to make is the need for NATO to continue and perhaps take more risk, particularly when it comes to providing the sort of support, heavy weaponry, indirect combat support and the like to help the Ukrainians do what they need to do to blunten and weaken the Russian offensive in Donbass and elsewhere.
Right, and a former NATO, a US general rather, was suggesting that more NATO involvement could mean some sort of humanitarian mission, getting involved in some sort of humanitarian mission more forcefully.
Yes, General Phil Breedlove, who I know well, as he was my sacker when I was the desacker. So we go back a long way together. And I think he's absolutely right. The caveat I would say is this. Number one, for NATO to do anything in Ukraine means that, and indeed for NATO to take more risk, means that NATO's got to be prepared for the worst case. And the worst case, of course, is war with Russia. So this would become something much bigger than it is already. And NATO needs to adopt a mindset, frankly, that is going to be that could be the case, and therefore it needs to prepare for that eventuality. I think the second point I'd make is that there's no such thing as being half in, half out. You're either in if NATO did decide to go down that route of providing humanitarian assistance and indeed providing protection to Odessa, which is what he also said. That would mean a NATO force to protect any humanitarian effort on the ground. And as far as the Russians are concerned, that would be an act of war. NATO would be in. So NATO's got to go in eyes wide open with a clear understanding of where it wants to get to and a strategy to get there and a strategy to manage the risks of getting there. And NATO's a long way short of being able to do that sort of thing. It brings us back to my first point about NATO being ready for the worst case, which is going to require a fundamental mindset change across the alliance as a whole.
Yeah, and General Richard Barrons was suggesting last week that NATO was not ready or prepared to get involved in a war with Russia. Do you think he's right?
Well, he's right in the sense that it's absolutely not ready. Frankly, the NATO effort thus far, in terms of reinforcing the eastern flank of the alliance, has been pretty curategish, good in parts, in the sense that the NATO response force has moved. They've got 40,000 troops on that border, but that is nothing like enough to present the sort of cast iron, solid deterrent capability that is going to overmatch the Russians if NATO wants to take risk, which I believe it should do. In terms of being prepared, well, that is going to require the consensus of 30 individual member states of NATO. And that takes time to achieve. And you have, as I've said elsewhere, NATO can only move at the speed of the slowest ship in the convoy. But ultimately, if the case is made, the leverage is taken and put on the alliance by the leader of the alliance, the United States, NATO could well get there.
And if NATO doesn't get involved more substantially, does Putin, in your view, end up winning this war?
Putin, if NATO does not get involved more substantially, I suspect that ultimately no one will win this war. I don't think the Ukrainians, and you're the man on the ground, and I'm sitting back in my comfortable armchair here, so I salute you for being the man on the ground. I suspect the Ukrainians will find it difficult to generate the sort of combat power and offensive maneuver capability in order to throw the Russians out of Ukraine, even with significant support in terms of weapons from the alliance. On the other side of the equation, I think the Russians, by all accounts, appear to have been significantly written down, as they demonstrated when they were defeated in the battle for Kiev. Their capability, their combined arms capability, their inability to dominate the air and win the air battle, their failure of logistics, and above all, their atrocious failures of morale, has meant them falling back on the destruction of cities, together with the associated ghastliness of the war crimes and criminal and mass rapes that we, I'm afraid, are seeing too much of. So I think this could well degenerate into a long, bloody war of attrition. And the only way to break that, I think, is for NATO to ramp up support for the Ukrainians.
And I mean, just the last question, a minute or so left. Where does Putin stop, do you think? Where does he end this?
There will be no peace in Europe while Putin is in the Kremlin. He wants to eliminate Ukraine, and he has already said he wants to bring all Russian speakers under the banner of Mother Russia, which must place the Baltic states in his target area. And so NATO, I think, has to recognize, we in the West have to recognize that Putin will not stop. Any form of ceasefire will just give him the means, give him the break he needs to try and reorganize, regain the initiative, and start all over again. And so the strategy has got to be thought through. How best can peace be guaranteed in Europe in the long term? And I think two aspects. Number one is weaken the Russians, as Lloyd Austin has said. Number two is that NATO is going to have to provide that ultimate security guarantee across the whole of Europe, including probably one day Ukraine.
OK, General Shirreff, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much indeed for having me.